you for spending your lunch with me and as we talk about health-centered design and reclaiming technology design for a culture of health. So raise your hand if you create technology. Okay, now keep your hand raised if you create technology that affects people's health. Okay, so I do. I'm a UX lead at Athena Health, and I was talking with a friend of mine who's an engineering manager at Airbnb, and we were talking about product design, and he said, look, you're always going to find that the flashing green button converts better. And I was like, okay, like, yeah, but that's not really gonna help me try to figure out how to solve the problems that I'm trying to solve for in my work. Like, the kinds of problems that I'm trying to solve for are, how do I get patients engaged with their health? One of the first projects in healthcare technology that I worked on was an app for physical therapy patients to help them adhere to their treatment protocol at home. Or how do I have practices manage their relationship with their patients? So I work on tools right now for practices to manage their communications plans with their patients. How do I help providers deliver care, right? The software that your doctor uses when you go into your appointment, and improve health outcomes. So I was working on quality performance management and tracking tools to help providers analyze their performance. And I said this to him, and he goes, oh, yeah, I see, that is different. And so I became very interested in, okay, what is that difference? You know, here's an engineering manager at Airbnb. This seemed like such an obvious thing, like their flashing green button converts better. And yet it turned out to be really limited. And so I started thinking about this, and I wrote an article about this, and starting to explore some of these ideas about where had our ideas about design philosophy and what makes good design come from. And so in 2003, in the pre-dawn of the digital technology era, behavior scientist B.J. Fogg wrote a book called Persuasive Technology, Using Computers to Change What We Think and Do. And this book became really seminal and foundational in technology design. He ended up going on to found the Stanford Persuasive Technology Lab, whose alumni include one of the co-founders of Instagram and people who work at Snapchat and Twitter and basically all the major tech companies. And then as I started looking at the design canon that had ended up on my own bookshelf over the years, there was, of course, Don't Make Me Think, Gamification by Design, How to Get People to Do Stuff with the universal symbol for hypnotism on the cover, and of course, the bestseller Hooked, How to Build Habit-Forming Products by Nir Eyal, who is also an alumnus of the Stanford Persuasive Tech Lab. So this was the canon, these are books that I've ended up on my own bookshelf, and maybe you have some of these books as well over the years. And then this design philosophy, which teaches us to coerce people and hijack their psychological and physiological vulnerabilities in order to get them to do stuff, ended up getting embedded into the products that now affect how billions of people experience their lives. And so now we're starting to see where this civilization-level experiment has led us. So the average millennial checks their phone 150 times a day, according to Excelling Qualtrics, and this is from 2017, so this is already dated, but even at this rate, this comes out to every 6.25 minutes, morning, noon, and night. You might be checking your phone right now, actually. And so the same study found that 53% of millennials wake up at least once per night to check their phone. Yep. Not a big surprise, considering that your sleep, is what one of the biggest technology companies considers to be its greatest competition. And they're not alone in this war on sleep. So hijacking our various physiological, psychological processes has become the goal of a lot of our technology. In order to keep us clicking and engaging and scrolling and refreshing, the algorithms, the content that the algorithms serve us must become increasingly emotionally inciting and increasingly extreme. Extremism, as it turns out, helps build habit-forming products. And God only knows what this is doing to our children's brains, as the former president of Facebook has famously said. But, of course, technology does not make itself. It is made by people. The concepting, designing, iterating, building, testing of all of these experiences has shown up in countless thousands of performance reviews. At scale, technology remakes culture. The persuasive design philosophy that proliferates through the products we use affects the behaviors that we adopt, the social norms we internalize, and the values we absorb. And then, we, ourselves the products of this culture, end up product designers, and the cycle repeats. But not everyone is trying to be this, right? Not everyone is trying to make the purest, most addictive, most potent product out there. I mean, some people are, and for those people, there is already a robust design philosophy. They can knock themselves out. Some of us are trying to be something like this. And what's interesting is that, so working in healthcare, working at Athena, we've had design consultants come in, and they talk about different design processes and methodologies and philosophies, and they know where they're going. They know they're coming to Athena. They know they're coming to, a healthcare company. And yet, the examples that so often dominate what they show us are like, okay, well, here's what Instagram is doing, and here's what CNN.com is doing, and here's, what some e-commerce site is doing, and none of that's really applicable to us. Like, see, maybe the methodologies are applicable, but the examples that they still point to, that are still pointed to, are still these companies that are designing for a very different goal than we are. Like, if I've gotten a doctor to spend more time on site, like, I've done something wrong. So, in our work, I think we may understand, we're thinking about healthcare, but in our culture, we have a very compartmentalized view of what it is that health is. This is how we tend to think about health, right? It's this category on the App Store. It's this very distinct, space separate from the rest of our lives. We outsource health. We relegate it to specific cordoned off sectors, noticeable particularly in its absence. We carve out space and time for health. We think, I can do this unhealthy thing now, I'll make up for it tomorrow. Health is a kind of transaction that we negotiate among a bunch of other concerns. It's a hobby or a trend of the year. And if we make technology that falls into this category, then we say, oh, we make digital health products. And if we don't make technology that ends up in this category, then we can simply believe that the technology we make doesn't affect people's health. But the experience of health is not compartmentalized, obviously. As the World Health Organization defines it, health is a resource for everyday life. It is woven into every aspect of our daily experience. Netflix affects our health. Instagram affects our health. This is just a screen cap of what you will find if you type in Instagram makes me into Google. Smartphones affect our health. The constant tilting down of your head can add up to 60-pound effective weight onto your neck. Even in our work, using enterprise software, the experience we have with technology affects our health. And all of this happens happens in the spaces that we design. Whether we work on consumer apps or enterprise software, the experiences that we put out there directly affect the physical, mental, social, professional health of our users. So what do we do with that? How do we act as agents of public health? As I said this morning, it's very fashionable to talk about design thinking and how do we bring that into our organization. But how do we bring health thinking into our products and design decisions? Or put another way, how do we move from a culture of don't make me sick, don't make me think, to a culture of don't make me sick? So, I started looking at this UX maturity pyramid that a lot of us have most likely seen. These are sort of like the Maslow's hierarchy of design values. Usable, useful, desirable, delightful. These are the words we all use and hear all the time to talk about design and technology. But these are values that we've inherited from the persuasive design era. What I propose we need is a new set of health-centered design values to help us create technology that is aligned with a culture of health. So, 1, from useful to responsible. So what does it mean to design responsibly? Fundamentally, it means understanding that the choices that we make have a direct impact on people's health, and looking at the ways that that can manifest beyond the intended use of our products. So for example, one of the first projects that I worked on for the physical therapy practice software that I was working for was this assessment that they needed to do. They needed to capture BMI and hip to waist ratio and blood pressure. And so in terms of, I'm thinking about this in terms of the fields that needed to be on the screen. They needed height, weight, hip circumference, waist circumference, and blood pressure. So I'm thinking, okay, well, the patient walks in and they're standing, so just let's get all the standing measures out of the way first, and then they can sit down and the clinician can take their blood pressure. And so I'm working with their physiologist, and I show this to her, and she goes, and she's this very attractive woman, and she goes, if I measure a guy's hip circumference and waist circumference, and then I take his blood pressure, I'm going to get a very different result than if I did it the other way around. And this blew my mind. Right? Because here I'm thinking about how to make it the most usable and useful and intuitive and streamlined. And it never even crossed my mind that the difference between this and this could have a whole cascade of consequences for this patient and many others down the line, and it would affect how the medical system understood them. Is it usable? I mean, it's just, either way, it's just fields on a screen, right? So evaluating this through the lens of usability was like almost irrelevant. It wouldn't give me that understanding of this difference. Here's another example. So I was on a site visit shadowing a provider through his daily workflow, and he was walking us through kind of what he did, and then at one point he stopped, and he was like, oh, I want to show you my stats. And these are stats are like how fast he could complete an order, or like how long certain things take. And this particular provider, so in addition to having obviously gone to medical school, which is very competitive, he'd also been in the Army, he'd been a medic, and where there's an added emphasis on rank. And so these stats were very important to him. He took them very seriously. And this is stuff that we know these stats because these tasks now take place in the system that we've designed. We can measure it because it's measurable, but it's profoundly new. Like, providers never had something tell them how long it was going to, what their average completion rate for a certain thing was, or like how long it took them to place an order. And suddenly, this system that can just track certain, it's now fundamentally impacting and affecting providers' understanding of their own relationship to their work, like how well are they performing? And this is something that's profoundly new. They've never had this before. Suddenly, we, the ones who are designing this system, we are creating this thing that's now affecting how providers understand their own performance. And this is actually all before we even get into abusability. Those are all, we were talking about second order effects, but as Dan Brown says, if usability is the capacity of a product to support a user's objectives, then abusability is the capacity of a product to enable one person to inflict harm on another. Ashkan Soltani, the former chief technologist for the Federal Trade Commission, says there's hundreds of examples of people finding ways to use technology to harm themselves or other people. And the response from so many tech CEOs has been, we didn't expect our technology to be used this way. We need to think about the ways that things can go wrong. Not just in ways that harm us as a company, but in ways that harm those using our platforms and other groups and society. So perhaps the most enduring piece of medical technology is the Hippocratic Oath. This is a fragment of the oath from papyrus from the 3rd century. So, this is from the time of the ancient Greeks. The Hippocratic Oath has been this pledge that medical practitioners undertake to uphold certain responsibilities. And commonly known as the shorthand, first do no harm. So now, centuries later, this applies to us as designers, as agents of public health. So how do we apply that in our design work? So first, establish responsibility for assessing the ways that the product design could have unintended consequences as part of the organizational design, as part of the charter. This is actually something that we're doing at Athena right now, and it's something that is informing everything from our job description on up. Create a dedicated internal review panel. So for example, at Athena, we have a patient safety team. I've heard other people bring this up here. I think other people also have patient safety teams that they work with. They evaluate any designs that we put out there to make sure that it's looked through that lens. But the same could be done for a harassment safety team to evaluate the potential abuse potential of a certain feature. And lastly, test and review with subject matter experts beyond users and beyond usability. So for example, the physiologists that I gave the example of, they came up with this insight that I would have never been able to come up with on my own. And Ashkan Soltani was even saying, incorporating futurists and science fiction authors and artists, as he says, Black Mirror has done more to inform people of the potential pitfalls of AI than any White House policy paper. So bottom line, today it is incredibly easy to create a highly usable experience that degrades the health of the people using it. So we have to start at a point beyond usable. It's awareness and understanding of our responsibility as designers that is the foundational starting point for health-centered design values. 2, from useful to pain-reducing. So in product design, we're taught to think in the language of usefulness. We talk about the minimum viable product and adding value. We never think about what the potential is of the ways that our products are potentially creating harm or pain for our users. Unless we talk about pain points, which are essentially just points of friction in accomplishing a task, which is still fundamentally about usefulness. But pain in design isn't just about friction, about when it's too hard to do what we need. Pain is now created at the opposite end of the spectrum as well, in compulsion, when it's too hard to stop when we want. So in a 2018 experiment on the effects of social media use on mental health, researchers at the University of Pennsylvania found that when participants limited their social media use to 30 minutes a day, they experienced statistically significant decreases in depression and loneliness than a control group that continued to use the networks, the platforms, as they normally would. And when the Center for Humane Technology asked 200,000 iPhone users how they felt after using different apps, what they found was that people tend to feel worse when they're after using an app for about 2.4 times longer than the length that makes them feel good to use it. And interestingly, despite their mission to colonize our sleep, Netflix actually starts to make us feel bad at about 85 minutes per day. So pain in design, whether experienced as friction or compulsion, is essentially an effect of time on the body. Something that might be enjoyable the first time or for the first minute becomes pain by the 85th time or the 85th minute. And something that's like, mildly annoying becomes pain at scale. So how do we think about pain reduction in product design? So these are two examples of a table design convention that we have as part of our design system at Athena. Okay, so don't think about like the content too. This is like all dummy content, but just looking at this from a UX point of view. So raise your hand if you prefer the option on the right. Raise your hand. No?
Right or
if you prefer, raise your hand if you prefer this option. Okay. And raise your hand if you prefer this option. Okay. So now, imagine that your job requires you to work through a list of hundreds of these entries per day. And you have to keep scrolling, you have to manage these different line items. The option on the right shows you 17 entries before you have to scroll, and the option on the left shows you 28 before you have to scroll. So at first glance, as you guys saw, the majority of people really prefer this roomier version of all this negative space, and it's very aesthetically appealing. But if you look at it through the lens of, at scale and at how you're going to be using this for hours at a time with managing lists of hundreds of entries, the option that everybody, not everybody, but some people preferred, creates a much greater actual physiological and physical tax and cognitive tax on the user. So pain in design is created at the anatomical level. I actually discovered I have this problem. This is actually when you're balancing the entire weight of your phone on your pinky finger. This is why PopSockets have sold 100 million of these things that you put on the back of your phone so you don't actually have to do that. And the anatomical consideration is only going to become something that has to take greater priority as we move into the realm of VR and 3D interaction design. If you're designing something where people have to move their arms like this versus like this, how much greater is that anatomical tax that is being put onto the user? Pain is created at the physiological level. The blue light that we all stare at constantly from our devices that wreaks havoc on our sleep cycles, affecting cognitive function, not to mention these stress response inducing red notification bubbles. And of course, pain is created at the psychological level as well. Which we'll get. This section will be what I focus on more in the next part of this. So, how do we apply pain reduction as a consideration in our design process? So, one, get comfortable talking about design in the language of pain. And I've even used this in conversations that I have with my developers where it's like, okay, well, yeah, we could do that way if we want to push pain down onto our users. And it's very hard to defend it that way. The exact same feature or the exact same approach is very hard to defend that way versus, well, it's useful enough, right? And that's an argument that you can just have forever and nobody wins. So positioning design in the language of pain allows us to reframe the conversations that we're having with our stakeholders and actually lets us arrive at potentially different design decisions that we might have otherwise. Two, design and test for use at scale and over time, right? So what is the experience of using this design in hour 8 at the end of the day as opposed to in the morning? Or that fancy, fun animation that looks great the first time something loads. What's the experience like the 85th time you have to deal with it? Lastly, and this is, I think, something that is really under-investigated and should be looked at much more in our design process. How does the design that we're putting out there affect people at the anatomical level, at the physiological level, and the psychological level? 3, from desirable to empowering. So we empower what we desire. I think that's a pretty familiar idea to most people. When we externalize our desire, that external reward becomes what drives us. And it's been scientifically proven. So in the 70s, researchers at Stanford found a way to undermine children's intrinsic interest in drawing. And they did it by giving them a prize. So they took a group of 3 to 5-year-olds and they put them into 3 different groups. The first group, they were shown a good drawing certificate, and they were asked if they wanted to draw in order to get the certificate. The second group, they were just in a room with crayons and markers and drawing utensils, and they were asked if they wanted to draw, and after they'd been drawing for a while, out of the blue, spontaneously, the researchers awarded them with a good drawing certificate. And the third group, they're just in a room with markers and crayons, and they were drawing the whole time. They never got a drawing certificate. So 2 weeks later, the researchers brought all of the kids back together. They put them in a room together with drawing utensils, and they looked at what happened. So what they found was that the kids in groups 2 and 3 drew for far longer than the kids in the first group. Why? Because the kids in the first group had their internal motivation to draw rewired. They now understood it as the reason they had drawn was in order to get that drawing certificate. And it turns out it's actually pretty easy to do this with adults as well. Persuasive design teaches us to subvert people's intrinsic desires and drives and motivations into drives and desire to use our product and engage with our interface. Or, as Nir Eyal puts it, when you're feeling uncertain, before you ask why you're uncertain, you Google. When you're feeling lonely, before you're even conscious of feeling it, you go to Facebook. Before you know you're bored, you're on YouTube. Nothing tells you to do these things. The users trigger themselves. So how can we flip the power dynamic? How can we design technology to empower humans rather than extracting desire from them in order to have power over them? So it comes down to what we measure. In the early days of social gaming, Zynga was among the first to really showcase the power of metrics around user actions, before a lot of the metrics were around page views and things like that. And Niels Hoven, a former product manager of Playdom, which was Zynga's primary competitor at the time, he writes, in this brave new world, metrics were king. Everything could be tracked, measured, tested. MBAs and management consultants were hired by the boatload. A good PM was one who could move the metrics, which frequently manifested as increasing short-term, easily measured metrics like revenue, at the expense of long-term, hard-to-measure metrics like user lifetimes. Throw another sale pop-up in there. The metrics say it's fine. One of the stories that Hoven talks about in terms of how this approach was applied in the broader tech market beyond gaming was a friend of his worked for a big technology company, and the friend was working on the search feature for this company, and they had this metric of their goal was to increase searches per user. So what's the most effective way to do that? Make the search results worse. And then Hoven writes, things started to go wrong. Products began to die as quickly as they had grown. Zynga lost 80% of its market cap. Shark fin graphs were everywhere as it became clear that virality and hypergrowth couldn't overcome the drag of weak long-term retention. So Peter Drucker famously said, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. user event metrics, it turns out, are just proxies that can be measured. They don't actually function as stand-ins for long-term product health. Designing for user empowerment comes down to reevaluating what we measure. So a group of researchers in Australia, Dorian Peters, Rafael Calvo, and Richard Ryan came up with what they call a model for motivation, engagement, and thriving in the user experience, or MET-UX. And what they did was they integrated self-determination theory into UX design. I think there's a lot of conversations that have been happening here around behavior change, so I'm assuming that self-determination theory has come up before, but in case not, developed in the 1970s, self-determination theory it identifies a set of core human needs that have been shown to be directly tied to, and in fact predictive of, a sense of well-being for humans. So autonomy, feeling agency and acting in accordance with one's values, competence, feeling able and effective, and relatedness, feeling connected to others in a sense of belonging. And the idea is that optimizing for these core human needs in the experience design that we put out promotes positive outcomes for people engaging with our products. So how do we apply this in the design process? And how does designing for user health align to long-term product health? So the self-determination theory needs functions really useful parameters for UX design for a number of reasons. One, they're measurable. So we can assess our design based on these things, right? We can evaluate, okay, do our users feel more autonomy? Do they feel like this is increasing their sense of confidence? Are they feeling more relatedness to others? They're scalable, so there's no such thing as like feeling too competent, as opposed to like stimulation, which you can definitely have like too much of this. And they're universal, so they can be applied to pretty much any user context. And these parameters can be evaluated through the different spheres of experience design. So at the interface, at the tasks that the interface enables, the behavior that is the accumulation of these tasks, and at scale, in a user's life and through culture. And because the self-determination theory needs are intrinsically rewarding, their satisfaction fosters positive user outcomes such as motivation, engagement, well-being, mastery, capability. And lastly, these outcomes drive key performance and business indicators such as adoption, retention, loyalty, referrals, etc. So to get a kind of a sense of like how you would put this whole story together, for example, autonomy, a core human need, is a measurable UX parameter that can be applied across the different spheres of experience design, for example, in the interface, leading to increased motivation and ultimately leading to adoption. So in healthcare, we are confronted with a very widespread example of what happens when these needs are not met. Physician burnout, which is comprised of emotional exhaustion, a sense of personal effectiveness, and depersonalization, or like a cynical and instrumental view towards others, is a direct inverse of the self-determination theory needs. And at Athena, we've actually done research both with our own users as well as competitors to try to understand what factors mitigate burnout. And what we found is that physicians who feel that they have the tools and resources and latitude they need in order to deliver high quality care are less likely to say that they experience burnout, less likely to plan to leave their job in the next 3 years, and more productive. And we call this constellation of effects self-perceived capability. And our research also shows that the EMR contributes directly to this sense of self-perceived capability, which makes sense because it is directly tied to how they perform their tasks. It's tied to how they manage their their business processes, how they manage their patient relationships, etc. And right now we're actually looking at can self-perceived capability actually provide a better indicator for attrition and referrals than NPS? And the interesting thing about that is that, you know, NPS doesn't help me design anything. It's like, oh, would you recommend this to a friend? Like, I don't know. Like, how would this help me design anything? As opposed to, does this increase your sense of self-perceived capability or not? Like, that actually gives me a sense of like, okay, this is moving in the right direction or not. So, how do we apply user-empowered practices to product design? One, use self-determination theory needs as parameters for UX design. You know, are you moving the needle up or down on autonomy, competence, relatedness? Understand that short-term metrics, they're just leading indicators. They are not end goals unto themselves. And frankly, they are the easiest those metrics are the easiest to move using design conventions that actually degrade user health. And lastly, design and measure for the long term, because sustained user health is inextricable from the long-term health of your product. 4, from delightful to dignifying. So in 2014, when UX Magazine published the UX Maturity Pyramid, they wrote, delightful is the highest level of UX maturity. The quality of emotional responses elicited by a product is the measure of its delightfulness. So on Christmas Eve of that same year, Eric Meyer wrote a post about this. This is Facebook's year in review app. And what Facebook had done was they had taken a photo that he had posted in his feed that year, and they had inserted it into this, you know, like delightful little wrapper with these dancing characters and balloons and confetti. Eric, here's what your year looked like. A picture of my daughter, Eric wrote, who is dead, who died this year. Yes, my year looked like that, true enough. My year looked like the now absent face of my little girl. In the wake of Meyer's post, the product manager for Facebook's Year in Review app told the Washington Post, we can do better. But it's been years now, and this sort of thing just keeps happening. This is from February, I found one. So perhaps they don't really think they can do better. The design of the Year in Review app, Eric Meyer wrote, is for the ideal user, the happy, upbeat, good life user. There wasn't enough thought given to cases like mine or anyone else who'd had a bad year. So in healthcare, we deal with a lot of people who might not be having a good year. And so to help simplify the complexity of designing for an environment like this, I created this kind of simple little equation to help unearth different scenarios. This template is specifically intended to identify and document the kind of situational variations that a typical ideal user story can gloss over. So for example, help me to do X thing when in a situation when A is true. And then help me to do X thing in a situation when B is true. So it's the same thing, but you're looking at the different, potential scenarios that might be going on in a user's life at that time. And these are not edge cases. These are not worst case scenarios. These are all people who use our products under different circumstances. And when you can lay all those, using that equation, you can create this sort of impact matrix to help design for, an account for these various situations. Dignity is about being treated like we matter, like our experience has value and worth. We all want to be treated this way. Designing for delight can often end up creating cruel user experiences that convey the exact opposite message. So how do we apply this to product design? 1, abandon the idea of a normal ideal user. 2, use a workflow or impact planning matrix to help understand the different situations that your product may be used in. This includes accessibility at a baseline, but extends far beyond that as well. And lastly, consider that the highest level of what we want from our products is not delight, it's dignity. Because dignity is at the core of what it means to be human. So our industry was once built on a legacy of persuasive, exploitative design. And that has brought us to the cultural moment we find ourselves in right now. So we're thinking, okay, right, like what can I do? Like how can I change, like I can't change the entire tech industry. What you can do is reframe the conversations you're having about design. Responsible. If you're testing usability, evaluate how the technology can affect people in ways beyond its intended use. Pain reducing. If you hear people talking about usefulness, question if that's actually coming at the cost of pushing pain down onto your users. Empowering. If you see people promoting metrics based on short-term user events and user actions, propose evaluating long-term user health and product health. And then if you hear people throwing around delightful, question if that's actually what people want from your product as opposed to dignity. So if you take just one thing away from this talk, I hope that it is a new vocabulary for a new set of health-centered design values to inform the kinds of design decisions that we make in our everyday work and the kinds of products that we put out into the world and align them with a culture of health. Thank you.